The conspiracist mind is not something that emerged yesterday, or with Donald Trump, as the left would be inclined to believe, nor with Bill Clinton, as many right-wingers would be inclined to believe following several intentional disinformation campaigns in 1998 by Democrat operatives. No. The conspiracist mind exists since there have been humans around, and will exist for as long as there will be humans, and will for sure exist many years after myself and everyone watching this will long be dead and buried. The difference is that the prevalence of conspiracist thinking can appear to be higher now than in the past, and one of the reasons is because we have destroyed a lot of structure without replacing it with anything. Let's explore. Hello everyone and welcome to the Freedom Alternative. Alright, so this is a topic that's been fascinating me for several years now, and I kept on postponing making a video about it largely because the topic is a lot more complicated than it would seem at a first glance. It's easy to just say, conspiracists are incredibly dumb, and if only they'd just acquiesce to some facts and logic, then everything would be better. The problem is that it's not that simple. Not if the goal is to understand the conspiracist mind rather than simply tackle some conspiracy-driven narratives. The latter is easy, and yes, most of the time is tackled by just simply getting superior evidence, i.e. facts, and applying more consistent logic. But that's uninteresting. There's billions of videos and books and articles out there talking about that, so take your pick. What's a lot more interesting is delving, even if just a bit, in the form of a short video, into the process of the conspiracist mind. Hence, the title of this video. Alright, so first of all, let's tackle the easy aspects. I used earlier the term conspiracy-driven narratives, which is a term that I like a lot more than conspiracy theory because it is more precise. A conspiracy-driven narrative is a story in which an undisclosed understanding between certain actors of the story is not just presumed, but presumed to be inherently evil, whilst no evidence of that understanding exists or can be produced. I prefer this term instead of conspiracy theory, also because the term conspiracy theory has been heavily destroyed, though I would seriously argue that it was flawed right from the get-go, given that it was popularized by Karl Popper, who was basically wrong. Also, the term conspiracy theory has been used wrongly so often, and that it's simply a waste of time to try to rehabilitate it in order to become precise once again, assuming that it was ever precise, which again I remain skeptical of. In addition to that, while the definition of a conspiracy theory is incredibly fluid, the purpose for which the term is being used is a fixed one, which is to shut people up and dismiss things. So, when we think about the conspiracist mind, we necessarily have to acknowledge right from the get-go that not all shady stories are necessarily a conspiracy-driven narrative. Some are, but many aren't. By the same token, not all conspiracy-driven narratives are necessarily wrong. Most are, but many aren't. This should not be controversial. There have been many well-documented instances of conspiracy-driven narratives that turned out to be true. The Australian Secret Intelligence Service spying on East Timor officials during key negotiations, CIA officials colluding with drug lords to bring cracked cocaine in the United States, the MK-Ultra program, the Soviet-Nazi collaboration, take your pick. Many of these, now undeniable historical facts, were, at some point in time, a mere conspiracy-driven narrative. Or the more recent one, namely that governments are indeed engaged in mass surveillance and spying of almost every living person. as of 2015 or 16, this is no longer controversial. But when I made this assertion first time in 2002, it was highly controversial, even though it was true at that time as well, and has been true for at least 25 years now. The second easy aspect of this topic is to also acknowledge that there does indeed exist such thing as a pathological conspiracist ideation, as the psychiatrists are calling it. In other words, looking at everything with a conspiracy angle can quite literally become a mental disorder in itself and make the individual a danger both to himself and to others around him. However, and this is where things become really complicated, the correlation is more pronounced in reverse, even though popular belief would indicate otherwise. In other words, certain people with mental disorders, particularly those on the schizotropy spectrum, are very likely to engage in conspiracist ideation too. But the reverse is rarely true, namely that conspiracist ideation in itself is rarely a good predictor of a pathology. In plain English, it is very likely that a loon is also a conspiracist, but it is less likely that a conspiracist is also a loon. This is what the evidence available suggests, and there will be links in the low bar for you to consult, of course. Since this is a video about conspiracies, I guess I'll have to take extra care on what kind of links I use. Nevertheless, even though there is a weak correlation between conspiracist ideation and pathologies, this doesn't stop activist researchers to try to enhance it using clever rhetorical devices or muddying the waters. Now, one could argue that this is well intended, because conspiracist ideation type of behavior does indeed lead to all sorts of behavior problems that ultimately harm the individual, such as neglecting one's own mental health, antisocial behavior, suboptimal eating habits, and so on and so forth. Even so, it is indeed unfortunate that, at least for the time being, dishonesty is being used to achieve an otherwise scientific goal, even if the goal is well intended. So with that in mind, finding a balance can become pretty complicated, which is probably why the world is getting more polarized, as those who are afraid of the answers stop asking questions altogether and ultimately become NPCs, basically, and those who aren't afraid of the answers keep on asking questions even if the answers have already been found. The latter category constitutes the conspiracist mind, those who are never satisfied with the answer. Now, how does one get there, and why? Well, that's quite complicated, but let me try a short version. I'm constantly being told that my videos are too long, but most topics are just not easy, so providing the answer in 5 minutes or less is only appropriate for propaganda, not for honesty. Now, I love to create propaganda too, just not on this channel. Anyway, so, as I was saying, the short version is this. The conspiracist mind is the result of a flawed manifestation of an otherwise useful trait in human nature that exists in various degrees in virtually all people. The useful trait is the need for structure. We know it's useful because hundreds of thousands of years of evolution not only failed to remove it, but entrenched it even further. Virtually all people do have a fundamental need for structure, and not just structure in their personal life, but structure in general. Structure in the way we construct thought, structure in their communities, structure in their wider society, structure in their personal relationship, and so on and so forth. The need for structure is the way virtually all societal norms and standards evolved, and it is largely the internal or mental engine that has driven most of science. On the positive extreme of the manifestation of the need for structure lies the cutting-edge science trying to make sense of the many aspects of our reality that are still unexplained to this day. On the negative extreme, however, lies the conspiracist mind. This has been true since forever, or at the very least in the last 1 or 2 thousands of years. But that still doesn't explain the apparent increase in conspiracist thinking. Well, since it's a video about conspiracies, maybe it's worth first asking the question: is there really an increase, or we're just being made to believe that? Well, as always, it's a little bit more complicated than that. In the sense that this is a chicken and the egg type of question, metaphorically speaking. On one hand, the conspiracist mind has always been part of the human experience, since it's part of a mental process that almost all people are capable of. On the other hand, it is nearly impossible to know how prevalent it was in, let's say, 1850 or 1250 or really even 1920. Current wisdom suggests that it was lower than today because information in general, whether true information or false one, traveled much slower than today. As a result, the story goes, fewer people were subjected to conspiracy-driven narratives. Now, the problem with that reasoning is that it doesn't really answer the question. At best, this kind of reasoning tells us that conspiracy-driven narratives might have been far more diverse then than they are today, given that people who would develop them had a much more limited audience, and outside government or church-sponsored disinformation, no conspiracy-driven narrative had any serious chance of becoming, well, viral in the way they tend to do today. But we can't know what was in the people's heads. For all intents and purposes, the evidence is inconclusive. It could very well be the case that the conspiracist mind was just as prevalent in 1850 as it is today, but the manifestations of it were certainly radically different. By the same token, it could very well be the case that there is more of it today than 100 or 200 years ago because the need for structure was much better fed then, or so it would seem. Because again, we can't know whether the more stable structure of back then was good enough to feed the need for structure inherent in most people. What we do know is that it was good enough to curb most of the manifestations of the conspiracist mind. So, is there a rise in conspiracy-driven thinking? Nobody can know for sure. The assumption is that it is, an assumption peddled by most of the cathedral media, albeit questioned by the psychiatric circles, is merely confusing the visibility of the manifestations with the cause. Yes, the manifestations of the conspiracist mind are certainly a lot more visible today than 50 or 100 years ago, but that's not good enough to conclude that there is a rise in conspiracist thinking itself. Anyway, to add to that, to illustrate via an example, here's a side story. During the days of the Romanian Revolution between December 17, 1989 and really all the way up to early January 1990, a lot of people believed all sorts of insane things that not only seemed quite implausible during those moments, but which were also thoroughly debunked later on. I recently re-listened to the broadcasts of Radio Free Europe from those times. Even though generally correct in their broadcast, once the trouble started, even the radio peeps from Munich started believing all sorts of, well, crap. Most people no longer believe any of that today, and most of them apologized or felt sorry for falling for obvious bollocks during those times, citing an adrenaline rush that clouded judgment from time to time. Well, the adrenaline rush is a weak excuse, but temporary clouded judgment is an accurate description. But the reason was the falling structure. You see, whenever there is a regime change attempt, especially a violent one, the structure with which one is accustomed to starts shaking and becomes uncertain. This is no surprise, that's the point of a regime change. And eventually, if the regime change attempt is successful, the whole structure collapses and is soon after replaced by another one, presumably one that is quite different. But in the moments between the commencement of the trembling of the old structure and the installation of the new one, that little period of uncertainty leaves one's need for structure unfed. And some people cope with that, of course, much better than others. The trembling and the fall of the old structure was dealt with by some through listening to banned music out loud, or broadcasting quite quasi-illegally messages against the party, or simply dressing in previously forbidden outfits. But others dealt with it by asking what now looks in retrospect irrelevant questions, and arriving at very far-fetched answers. So while conspiracist thinking was not necessarily more prevalent on December the 22nd, 1989 Romania than, let's say, same country on November the 3rd, 1989, so a month and a half before, the manifestation of it was certainly more prevalent as the structure was trembling and heading towards collapse. And not knowing that, because most people did not know the whole thing is going down, not knowing that is what created the anxiety around the need for structure, and that fueled a lot of conspiracy-driven narratives. Well, that and the fact that many actors intentionally use that to forward their own narratives, but that's a story for another day. Okay, so now we know. We're looking at an increased manifestation of conspiracist thinking. But why? Well, again, it's not that simple. Though, if you would read Time magazine, it would tell you that it is very simple and that all you need to do is to allow yourself to be subjected to an FBI-led re-education program. Well, they don't quite say that, but Time magazine, in a quest to be slightly less dishonest than its standard, figured it out that conspiracist thinking isn't going anywhere. Of course it doesn't, it's been part of the human experience since forever. But instead of delving further into the question, they simply conclude that Orange man bad, Facebook man bad, YouTube man bad, and the FBI can help because otherwise there will be more domestic terrorism, but only from the right, of course. Because, you see, conspiratorial thinking in left-wing activists that leads them to shoot Republican congressmen is not an issue. Or conspiratorial thinking in left-wing activists that makes them think words are violence and makes them become violent are also not an issue. Anyway, the apparent increase in conspiratorial thinking is due to a confluence of factors, and most of them are easy to spot if one understands how the conspiracist mind functions. So, for starters, there's the structure issue that I mentioned at the beginning of the video. No matter how you look at it, increasing numbers of people lack structure. Hyperatomization is in itself a risk factor for mental health in general, and it's also a contributing factor to cultivating a conspiracist mind, not necessarily in a pathological way, but it's a factor. In the past, people had a church or a social club, the pub being the best example, where they'd go and find some answers to more complicated questions. They weren't always the best answers, of course, but the need for structure was better fed, for sure. Between the pub, the church, the family, and the co-workers, that combination did a good enough job. Today you can't really ask complicated questions at work or debate them because the complicated questions are hate speech and you lose your job. Nobody goes to church anymore, and families are increasingly broken up, and the pubs have, for the most part, been shut down under regulations that made them expensive and or uninteresting. So what's left? Well, not much. Because while the old structures were slowly torn apart for various reasons and they weren't replaced with anything, the need for structure is still there and it will stay there. This is what happens when revolutionaries who don't understand human nature are allowed to implement their ideas and are not put in their place in due time. Then there is the issue of institutional credibility. While a propensity towards conspiratorial thinking exists in most people and has existed for most of history, the collapse of institutional credibility is something rather new. There was little to no reason for the average person to heavily question science in 1930 or even the 1960s. Most people trusted the institutions of science because, well, for the most part, they weren't seriously wrong. Or if they were, they figured that out in due time and adjusted and apologized and came up with superior reasoning. I'm not saying this was necessarily true, but that was the generally accepted perception. Today, however, only an idiot really trusts a university uncritically. The activist researchers masquerading as scientists have gotten things wrong so often, so blatantly, and often intentionally so, that it is no wonder that fewer people than ever bow to their authority. I mean, why would they? Now, the problem is that, at least for now, nothing has risen up to replace that authority. We're in the transition period. Eventually, something will rise to replace it, but until that happens, the inherent lack of credibility of the legacy institutions is a very legitimate reason for an increase in manifestation of the conspiracist mind. This is best evidenced by the disproportionate discussion concerning climate change. The IPCC has finally adjusted its numbers to be significantly closer to reality, but nobody believes them anymore. Even if this time they're significantly less wrong than they were merely 5 years ago or 10 years ago. Why? Well, because they lied for decades, that's why. When you gather 100 years of activist bullcrap masquerading as science and 100 years of very wrong predictions, it should be no surprise that nobody's buying it anymore. Or, if you don't like the example with climate change, take any other narrative from the cathedral media. The cathedral has lied so often, so blatantly, so consistently, that at this point it is simply absurd to believe them prima facie. That in itself is not a manifestation of conspiracist thinking, of course, but in conjunction with the previously mentioned factor, does contribute to a rise in manifestation. And these two are not the only factors. Third one, there is the issue correctly identified even by the Time magazine, to which I also alluded to at the beginning of this video, namely that terminology like conspiracy theory has been used too much to dismiss any form of complicated thought, which in the end helped exactly nobody. It didn't forward superior discourse, it didn't forward superior reasoning, and it also did not persuade anyone to abandon conspiracist thought. Quite the opposite, it made the already existent issue a lot worse. Basically, the more you mock the conspiracist for being a conspiracist, the more entrenched in that view the conspiracist becomes. Anyone who has ever read a few books on psychology, social influencing, and propaganda knows this very well, because it applies to a lot of things, not just believers in conspiracy-driven narratives. There was even a time when this was common knowledge, but then again, there was a time when people read more, reacted less, and had longer attention spans. Today, however, it seems that only conspiracists still retain the long attention spans. Those who may wish to debunk them, not so much. Not anymore, anyway. The point is that this is a factor in the apparent increase in the visible manifestations of the conspiracist mind. The fact that complicated discussions are increasingly dismissed outright, regardless of their value. Sure, some are complete garbage, but if I had $1 every time I heard or saw comments complaining that a university course or a 2-hour discussion on a very complex and timely issue is just too long, I'll be able to fund my Gulag research twice. Speaking of which, please send me to the Gulag. But no, seriously, the consistent ridicule of complex questions and of less conventional skepticism is in itself a factor that contributed to the apparent rise in manifestations of conspiracist thinking, and it will not get better anytime soon, precisely because none of these three factors, and others of smaller importance, are being seriously addressed. The only discussion about the conspiracist mind available in the mainstream is either in the form of edgy dismissal, which not only doesn't help, but arguably makes things worse, or in the form of militant left-wing activism masquerading as concern for the effects, like Time magazine, which effectively argues for the thought police to be deployed against anyone not on the furthest fringes of the far left like them. As for the so-called solutions proposed, as if there is such thing as solutions, None of them address the issue. No, making YouTube use algorithmic magic to stifle out some clips is not addressing the issue, nor is pressuring Facebook to do the same. Nobody seems to realize that most of the content they suddenly fear has been around long before YouTube or Facebook existed. I mean, heck, I was watching David Icke's conspiracy crap in 2001. There was no Facebook and YouTube at the time, but if one was interested, there was a way to find them. I think I still have a few CDs with conspiracy documentaries. I watched plenty of them between 1998 and 2003 as part of my long study on how to construct propaganda. And by the way, they weren't really harder to find in 2001 than they are today. It's just that the internet speeds were lower. But in the end, if you wanted to know about shape-shifting reptilians, it wasn't really hard to find them. And they had huge audiences then too, highly comparable to what they get today. It's just that the cathedral media bubble was a lot less aware of it. That's all. The point I'm trying to make is that trying to censor or suppress conspiracist content doesn't exactly help anyone. At best, it achieves nothing, and at worst, it makes everything worse. So, what does help? At the individual level, I mean. Institutions can't exactly do much except for, well, becoming more credible. But at the individual level, well, for starters, recognize how this works. Learn to recognize when your natural tendency of forming patterns, which is an expression of the need for structure, is being exploited. People naturally seek patterns where there simply aren't any. There's been multiple studies on that, and I'll leave one in the description, by the way. So, when someone tries to show you a pattern, ask multiple questions and see if your natural tendency to recognize patterns isn't interfering with your reasoning. There's no reason to be ashamed by this. It happens to the majority of people, and it's one of the reasons cherry picking is such a successful manipulation technique. Because people want to believe things. You know, the conspiracist meme, I want to believe, is not exactly a meme. Most people want to believe things. In other words, incipient forms of the conspiratorial mind are in almost every one of us. Well, about 2/3 of us, based on most studies. Secondly, learn some humility. Chances are you don't know everything about the topic being discussed. As a result, always leave the possibility open that you might be entirely wrong, or at the very least, you're missing something from the picture. Now, that doesn't mean perpetual self-doubt. That's postmodernism and it's cancer. But it does mean a healthy dose of modesty, or if you want, accounting for the fallibility of the human mind. Thirdly, always remember that human stupidity is at the very least constant, if not growing. Which is a nicer way of saying that people are not stupid, people are fucking stupid. In other words, start with the assumption that you're dealing with incompetence or stupidity rather than malicious intent and vast conspiracy. Sure, sometimes you may still end up with a conspiracy as the answer, just because sometimes conspiracies do happen. But the end game is to avoid being needlessly wrong. Well, at least the end game of what I am proposing. The end game of the mainstream proposals appears to be one that one should always conclude that no conspiracy ever happens anywhere, and believing otherwise makes you a potential domestic terrorist. And finally, if the explanation you can come up with, the best explanation you can come up with is a conspiracy, then try to reason it out in a way that still sounds plausible. For instance, if the best explanation you find is a conspiracy of 3 people, then it's time to ask for feedback from people you trust. You know, subject your hypotheses to peer review, basically. But if your conspiracy requires the silence and/or collaboration of hundreds or thousands of people across multiple countries and organizations, both state and private, then maybe you need to think a bit more on the issue. Because the likelihood of such a conspiracy to have happened without nobody leaking intel or blowing the whistle is, well, pretty low. So, to sum up. People will always look for patterns and will always find them, whether they are indeed there or not. And some people, I mean the really committed conspiracists, will never change their mind no matter what the facts show. And there is nothing that can be done about this without seriously infringing not just on the rights of the individuals, but also on the integrity of the civilization itself. If asking inconvenient questions becomes haram, then we might as well turn off the lights on this civilization because we're no longer different to any other autocracy. By the same token, individually, one has to figure it out for himself, usually by trial and error, when have there been enough questions. I know this is not an easy process, and it's not an equal process, and the results vary not just based on the amount of information available, but also based on intellectual capacity too. But hey, I didn't say it is easy. The mainstream media says it's easy, and, well, they're wrong. It's not easy. Anyway, I'll leave some more links in the description box with further reading. Notice that I didn't mention anything in this video on how to approach committed conspiracists, and the reason is simple. I don't think most people should. At some point, that ceases to be worth the trouble, unless you're a psychiatrist or some other type of therapist whose job is to help such people. So with all of that being said, thank you all for watching. Thank you for your consistent and generous support. Please consider a donation should you derive any value from the work being done here. Don't forget to subscribe. Send me to the gulag. And I will see you all soon on the Freedom Alternative.